It is an extraordinary pleasure for us finally open today the Young Security Conference 21 live from Amerikahaus here in Munich. My name is Mike Schnierer, and together with my colleague and friend Amelie, we open the conference on behalf of the whole entire YSC team. Many months of work and uncertainty are now behind us, and I believe that we have planned an exciting and innovative program that will address the current trends and issues in foreign and security policy. We are now eagerly looking forward to the next 2 days, to the common exchange, to the new perspectives and changes of views, to the discourses and the new things that even come up at such events. The Young Security Conference is a unique initiative that stands out for its participatory and innovative character. It aims at connecting young thinkers with policy experts and academic scholars in critical, fruitful and constructive dialogue about the future of European security and defense. It combines a flagship conference with a strategic fellowship program. The conference has a special meaning for us because all partners focus on participation, their understanding and the European political education of the participants, but also of the audience. We aim to connect young thinkers with political experts and academic scientists in a dialogue about the future of European security and defense and to discuss the common issues with the interested public. It is very, very regrettable that we have to postpone the last conference for the time being due to the current pandemic. But not holding it was not an option for us. So we are very happy that we finally opened the conference today. We would have been very happy as well to meet this year's fellow of the Young Security Conference. Therefore, our first warm welcome goes out to all YSC fellows. And we promise to make up the face-to-face meeting as soon as possible. This year, the focus of our conference is in 4 important topics. European security policy is one of them, climate security and the Green Deal, EU neighborhood security, health security, and cyber security. Through this framing, we want to aim to contribute sustainable debates and policy analysis and the most pressing challenges of EU security policy. We look forward of offering you debates with exciting experts from politics, think tanks, and academia over the next 2 days. The debates will always accompanied and moderated by our YSC fellows. Before I hand over to my dear colleague Amelie, I would like to say a few words of thanks on behalf of the entire YSC team. Because a conference like this does not organize itself alone. Many partners and friends are necessary for a conference and a fellowship program to emerge in the end. So at first of all, I would like to thank the Amerikahaus for generously hosting our conference and providing professional technical support. Dear Ms. Zwingenberger, dear Mr. Faltermeier, and dear Mr. Glaser, thank you very much. We are glad to be your guests. A further thanks goes out to Brussels, to our colleagues from the European Liberal Forum, who have strongly supported us in planning and implementing the panels. Anastasia, Lauren, Andre, and the rest of your team, you made a great work. Thank you. Would like to express a special thank to Professor Frédéric Charillon and Professor Stefan Stetter for their scientific support. You have the possibility to see both of them in a few minutes. To all of you who are not named now, we would like to say thank you very much. It's great to have you with us. I wish you, and I wish us all, an exciting conference. Thank you for your interest, and to be honest, I am very relieved that the YSC is finally starting.
Thank you, dear colleague Mike. On behalf of Europa-Nova and Europa-Nova Germany, thanks to you all. I'm very grateful for sitting here today and to introduce this conference, which of course has in its name that it is young, but it's not only young, it is innovative. We want to challenge the mainstream. We want to go out and to propose a new program that brings together, as my colleague just said, scholars, young professionals, interested participants, and engaged practitioners in order to challenge the conversations and the discussions on the future of the European Union. And it is more important than ever nowadays in the new world order, within the actually very complicated new geopolitical frame and context that the European Union faces today, that we bring together different actors and the new generation in order to discuss the topics that Mike just introduced. And I'm very happy also to announce the participation of Her Excellency Mrs. Ambassador Marianne de Cottes that will just follow now with an introductory speech in order to talk about the Franco-German aspect of our conference. And we will have afterwards a little and a very complex and very interesting discussion of Professor Stetter here sitting in Munich and Professor Charillon from Clermont-Ferrand in order to introduce this interesting panel on European sovereignty and autonomy. This topic of European sovereignty and autonomy is a topic that is discussed since many, many years within the European Union. It is also a discussion that is very complicated among European member states. We want to just right now take a moment in order to thank you all for supporting us, for supporting the Young Security Conference, and invite you to participate in this process, in this program, through Slido, for example, on our social media channels, and on our new website, youngsecurityconference.de. And I will now give the floor to Her Excellency Anne-Marie de Cottes, that we'll see now on the screen directly. Thank you very much, and have a very, very wonderful day, very interesting panels, and see you soon.
Cher professeur Stetter, cher professeur Charillon, mesdames et messieurs, le ministre français des Affaires étrangères, Jean-Yves Le Drian, résume souvent notre époque, marquée par les multiples crises et menaces, par une formule qui est la brutalisation du monde. Ce contexte mondial spécifique exige toute notre vigilance et les conférences de sécurité telles que la vôtre sont, je crois, un lieu idéal pour réfléchir à l'état du monde. Plus particulièrement, les conférences de sécurité qui mobilisent les jeunes revêtent une grande importance, car vous serez, vous, les jeunes générations, celles et ceux qui feront le monde de demain et en assurerez la paix et la sécurité. C'est pourquoi je vous remercie de m'avoir convié à intervenir en ouverture de cette seconde édition de la Young Security Conference. Je tiens à remercier le think tank Europa-Nova, l'Université Clermont-Auvergne et l'Université de la Bundeswehr de Munich. Cette initiative franco-allemande vise à créer des liens entre des étudiants, des diplômés de l'enseignement supérieur, des jeunes professionnels du monde entier et des experts en matière de politique, de sécurité et de défense. La thématique retenue pour cette année, l'autonomie stratégique de l'Union européenne, est effectivement au centre des préoccupations françaises, allemandes et européennes. Elle couvre de nombreux secteurs, tels que la transition énergétique, la transformation numérique, la sécurité sanitaire et la politique de voisinage. Autant d'enjeux qui appellent une coopération multilatérale et d'abord européenne, pour laquelle le tandem franco-allemand s'engage pleinement. La Young Security Conference encourage les échanges thématiques de haut niveau. Elle participe ainsi à l'émergence d'idées nouvelles pour l'avenir de l'Union européenne. Cela est particulièrement précieux dans le cadre de la conférence pour l'avenir de l'Europe. Le dialogue entre les citoyens sur l'avenir de notre continent est indispensable et l'implication de la jeunesse dans l'élaboration de propositions pour l'avenir de l'Europe est absolument essentielle. Le travail que vous allez mener pendant ces 2 journées est donc particulièrement formateur pour la future génération de décideurs que vous êtes. Dans le traité d'Aix-la-Chapelle, signé en 2019, la France et l'Allemagne ont affirmé leur détermination à œuvrer ensemble pour une Union européenne forte, souveraine, durable et résiliente. Conseil des ministres qui s'est tenu le 31 mai dernier, Conseil des ministres franco-allemand, a été l'occasion pour les gouvernements français et allemands de rappeler les enjeux auxquels l'Union européenne est confrontée aujourd'hui. Parmi ceux-ci, le dérèglement climatique, la transformation numérique, la sécurité du voisinage et la sécurité sanitaire occupent une place tout à fait centrale. Pour faire face à ces défis, renforcer la capacité de l'Union européenne à agir est absolument nécessaire. La lutte contre les dérèglements climatiques implique des transformations profondes des sociétés et des économies européennes. L'Europe s'engage à cet égard dans une politique très ambitieuse. Les mesures de décarbonation de l'industrie européenne doivent cependant aussi profiter à la relance économique de l'Union européenne. Et à ce titre, le président de la République et la chancelière ont rappelé, à l'issue de leur dernière rencontre bilatérale le 18 juin 2021 à Berlin, le rôle central de l'hydrogène, de la microélectronique et des clouds, secteurs dans lesquels il faut absolument accroître les investissements pour renforcer la compétitivité de l'industrie européenne. La France et l'Allemagne jouent un rôle moteur dans la relance verte, notamment à travers le groupe de travail franco-allemand dit de Meseberg sur le climat. L'initiative conjointe Make Our Planet Great Again est également une composante importante de la coopération franco-allemande en matière de recherche sur le climat, l'énergie et le système terrestre, qui marque notre volonté commune d'inscrire l'action de l'Union européenne dans un cadre plus large, car nous sommes tous collectivement responsables de notre planète. Comme le disait Ban Ki-moon, le secrétaire général des Nations Unies au moment de la COP 21, il n'y a pas de plan B parce qu'il n'y a pas de planète B. De la même manière, il nous appartient de tirer parti de la transformation numérique pour agir en faveur de l'environnement et du climat. Face à la concurrence étrangère, en particulier de grandes entreprises du secteur des technologies, nous devons renforcer la souveraineté numérique européenne. La confidentialité, l'intégrité, l'accessibilité des données jouent à cet égard un rôle clé. Pour atteindre ces objectifs, la France a impulsé 2 projets majeurs en 2021 que je voudrais citer. Tout d'abord, le projet de campus cyber à la Défense, initié par le président de la République. Ce campus rassemblera les principaux acteurs nationaux et internationaux du domaine de la cybersécurité. Et deuxième projet, pour faciliter l'effort de recherche et développement et créer un nouvel écosystème français de la cybersécurité, le gouvernement a lancé un grand défi cyber qui se concentre sur les réseaux, l'Internet des objets et la cybercriminalité. En outre, cette souveraineté numérique est une condition indispensable pour atteindre l'objectif de sécurité sanitaire. La France et l'Allemagne soutiennent la création d'un espace européen des données de santé dans un objectif double. Premièrement, il s'agit d'améliorer la qualité de la recherche dans le domaine de la santé, de l'élaboration des politiques de santé et des soins prodigués. Mais, deuxièmement, il s'agit aussi de lutter contre les menaces sanitaires qui sont forcément transfrontières du fait de la mobilité et des échanges. Renforcer la sécurité sanitaire européenne implique enfin de garantir la résilience et la durabilité des chaînes logistiques de l'Union européenne. Pour faire face à tous ces défis qui s'imposent à nous, l'action du couple franco-allemand est absolument indispensable pour permettre à l'Europe de se doter des instruments nécessaires à l'affirmation de son autonomie. Et cette action s'inscrit largement dans le cadre du partenariat transatlantique et du multilatéralisme. Je vous remercie pour votre engagement dans ce cadre et vous souhaite des échanges très fructueux lors de ces 2 journées de conférence. Et je vous remercie de votre attention.
Again, I would like to, first of all, to thank the organizers of the Young Security Conference for putting together this important event, which brings together you, young professionals from all over Europe, and as the ambassador just said, decision makers, future decision makers in and for Europe. I would like to give in my introductory talk where I would like to thank the organizers for having again invited me and the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich to be a co-organizer and academic scientific advisor to this important project. I would like to make a some arguments about where I see Europe and strategic autonomy developing. And I would like to do this in 4 steps, really. First of all, to prepare the fundamentals. What are we actually talking about when we say strategic autonomy? Secondly, I would like to discuss with you a bit what are the challenges that Europe and the European Union faces in that context. Third one is to look deeper at the issue of autonomy, and there I would like to stress in particular the topic of resilience, which figures prominently in current European policy discourse. And finally, some problems and opportunities that I see in that context. So first of all, what do we mean when we say strategic autonomy? That is a discourse which relates to the global role of the European Union. The European Union probably is no longer, it has developed over the course of the last 20, 25 years since the Maastricht Treaty. The neighborhood is still very important, and I would argue that is, the main terrain on which European foreign relations play out. But we can see this in terms of trade agreements. The European Union negotiates trade agreements with emerging powers all over the world. And the European Union plays an important role in multilateral institutions, in what we refer to as global governance. And in that context, the question has become much more pertinent. What kind of abilities does the European Union have? What kind of capacities can it build on and bring into international politics? And it was the French President Emmanuel Macron who was talking about European sovereignty, that Europe has to be able to act on an international stage, because otherwise, if Europe is not able to act, the challenges which we see in the 21st century, and I will talk about them in a moment, will put Europe behind if Europe is not able to react united. And united also means that there has to be some form of sovereignty. Now, that is a very contested term. Traditionally, we associate sovereignty with nation states. And obviously, we see a big transformation going on in European politics, where the issue of sovereignty is something that is no longer preserved for nation states only. The European Union is much more than an international organization. We are used to call it in political science a supranational organization, but in many aspects, it is a sovereign actor. The European Union has legal personality since the Lisbon Treaty of 2009, and this legal understanding of legal personality has to be transformed in political personality. And political personality, I think, is what President Macron was really talking about. Now, this has also been taken up not just by state leaders, by foreign ministers, by many politicians and citizens who would like to see the European Union to act more united and strong in international relations, but also by actors from the European Union stage. Let's look at the European Commission. I think President Jean-Claude Juncker and Commission President von der Leyen have been very explicit in that. They give State of the Union addresses in the European Parliament, and Juncker was talking about Weltpolitikfähigkeit. Long term, he has used the German expression in his speech to the European Parliament, but what he meant was that Europe has to be able to act as a responsible and also as a powerful actor on a global stage, to be able to perform on a global stage. Weltpolitikfähigkeit. President von der Leyen has voiced her objective to lead a geopolitical commission that acts and thinks geopolitically. Now, I cannot and I don't want to go into details, but we see all this reflected also in the way in which the European Union tries to rearrange its foreign policy. The EU security strategy of 2016, commissioned by then High Representative Federica Mogherini, was also very clear in that. The EU has to use the entire arsenal of foreign policy instruments, and it has to be clear in what kind of position it wants to have in world politics. a more powerful, a more resourceful European Union foreign policy, not just because the European External Action Service has been established and is now functioning, but also in terms of Europe's perspective on international politics. A strong and united Europe, I think, is one of the big issues which we see very much reflected in this European security strategy. But also Europe, which is liberal and is based on a certain European way of living, which is based on liberalism, which is based on open societies, and which is based on what could be termed a European model, which is not exclusive to Europe or European history, but it's a building block of what the entire project of European integration is about. And I think from that perspective, Europe has moved some way from the 1970s and 1980s. I invite you very much in your deliberations to also reflect on where did Europe stand 20, 30, 40 years ago. We didn't have a European Union with legal personality. We didn't have a European Union foreign policy, which is not perfect, but which is now integrated in the European Union External Action Service. So I think Europe has moved some way from the 1970s, when European political cooperation was established, to the Maastricht Treaty, when the second pillar, the common foreign and security policy, was established, to the situation which we have today. Is the situation easy? No, that's my second point. It's not easy because there are big challenges for Europe on a global stage. And I would like to divide these challenges in two baskets. One of them is actor-related instability. There are challenges which the European Union faces in relation to other actors on a global stage. Of course, traditionally, if you look at the first security strategy written by Javier Solana in the early 2000s, terrorism was the big issue there. Transnational actors which bring insecurity in international relations, and this remains an important topic. But I think we can see, and the security strategy of 2016 is prime example of this, we can see that actor-related instability or challenges come from a much wider set of actors. The big thing, the big topic addressed in the security strategy of 2016 is instability in Europe's neighborhood, which stems from authoritarian governments, which stems from political crisis in Europe's neighborhood. The immediate neighborhood in the east, if you think of Belarus or Ukraine, in the southern neighborhood, but also further south in the Sahel area. So there are many insecurities which stem from insufficient state structures, from a lack of democracy, from a lack of real participation, and from conflicts which can spill over to Europe. Another form of challenge relates to actors which at times challenge the European Union. Now, I would very much advise not to see international politics being divided in like a chessboard amongst the big players which have to compete with each other. That is a perspective on international politics of the 19th and early 20th century, which we should leave behind. But we should see that also those who occasionally are partners sometimes are very difficult competitors on an international stage. If we think of Russia, which very much sees Europe as challenging what Russia perceives as its sphere of influence in the Southern Caucasus, in Eastern Europe and other areas. Or if we look at China. Now, all these, and China, Russia, they will remain important powers in the 21st century, and you can add India, Brazil, Turkey, and others to that. But there are challenges stemming from competition on an international scale of who has more power and influence in relation to each other. And I think Europe has to be firm and united, not in order to confront Russia or Turkey or China, but in able to protect its interests and its values in international affairs. And sometimes, you can define common interests with these emerging or global powers, but sometimes you also have to be firm in defending your interests. And the second then is not actor-related instability, but what I would call structural instability or structural challenges. And they come from technological change, to which Europe, as other parts of the world, has to adapt. It comes from climate change, as the ambassador has mentioned, and from other risks, as we call it probably in academic discourse in sociology, coming from foreseen and from unforeseen risks like pandemics. We didn't really talk about pandemics a few years ago. I remember, I always recall that this always has been an abstract topic in many policy discussions. There might be a global pandemic, but let us be honest, whoever thought that something like COVID-19 would really happen? Now it happened, and I think it will also transform our understanding of unforeseen and foreseen risks and how to respond to them. Now, again, without going into detail, I think what the security strategy of 2016 mentions very much is the topic of resilience. Europe has to be resilient in relation to all these instabilities and challenges, independently of whether they come from actors or from structural risks. Be resilient, be able to adapt to challenges, whatever they are. And in that context, also be able to transform. If you don't transform, you are not resilient. You have to have a governance structure. We have to have a society in Europe that is able to transform, to respond to changes, not by staying the same, but by transform. I think this is very important. And also exporting this understanding of resilience to an unstable neighborhood, or at times unstable neighborhood. And I think enlargement plays still a very important role here. If we talk about the Western Balkan region, I'm a big supporter of a European perspective and a quick European integration perspective for the countries in the Western Balkans. Now, I think, the balance sheet is always mixed, but I think it's important to stress, sometimes we hear Europe hasn't done really anything and it has failed in reacting to COVID. And I think it's true, in the first few weeks of COVID, we have seen an inability to respond to this pandemic in a combined European way. But I think this has given way quickly to an understanding that we can solve this and other crises only by being united, and by having a shared European governance approach to all these issues. And I think the next generation EU project and the way the EU budget has now signed for this decade, for the 2020s, is an encouraging sign. Next generation EU focuses on two very important topics, that is digital transformation and the European Green Deal. We have to be resilient, not by staying the same, but by changing. We have to adapt to a changing international environment. And digital transformation and responding to climate change on the basis of a Green Deal seems to me very important. And you will look at this next generation EU deal. There are things that can be criticized, but I think this focus is a very important and forceful European response. Europe is not looking back, it's looking forward. Where do we want to see the European Union in 2050? And digital transformation and responding to climate change are very important. And the third one is institutional transformation, always tricky in Europe because there are veto players. Institutional reform is a very hot potato, which hasn't been touched for a long time since the Lisbon Treaty. But I think the Conference for the Future of Europe, also mentioned by the ambassador, is a very important institutional project. And I hope very much that we see in this Conference for the Future of Europe encouraging impulses for the future of Europe, in particular based on this model of citizen participation. If you look at the Conference of Europe and also what Eurostat tells us about public opinion in the European Union, a democratic European Union is important to many Europeans. The European integration is not an elite project. It's something which is in the interest of people, of normal people. And in the end, all of us are normal people all over Europe. And this is what Eurostat shows us, and opinion polls, which show that there is a European identity, European political identity. And this is something I think which we have to bring in all these debates. It's not just about cooperation between states. The European Union is more than the sum of member states. It's a political project of its own. And it's a political identity, which I think we all carry. And if this is the understanding on which the institutional, but also the policy-related design of the European Union builds, I'm not pessimistic, I have to say. Now, there are some problems and opportunities, obviously, and time-wise, let me just close by saying that I think, and these are topics which I think you should discuss at this conference. There are the challenges from abroad, and I have referred to them, the unforeseen and foreseen risks on a structural basis, relations to other political actors, emerging powers in particular, with which the European Union can get into geopolitical conflicts. How do we deal with that? And the third one are contestations from within. European integration is not uncontested. Maybe we can go so far to say that European integration is a kind of political cleavage which shapes party systems all over Europe. There are political forces which oppose European integrations. There are many people who support European integration but are skeptical of transferring more and more sovereignty to the European Union, but they are not anti-European Union. And then there are very powerful political forces which very powerfully are in favor of much more European integration. The Volt Party, for example, which thinks about a pan-European party platform, is a point in case. So these contestations from within is something, I think, which also has to be mentioned in Europe. Sometimes the compromise was to focus not on the big issues, but on little projects, as in European defense policy at the moment, the PESCO initiative. I think it's important. It always has been a strength of the European Union, not just to engage on the big issues, but on day-to-day projects which are funded. So a good balance has to be struck between these between these two elements. So this combination of challenges and opportunities which we see within the European Union, but which we have to put on the table as we do at the Conference for the Future of Europe, and how to deal with the actor-related and the structural challenges which we see on a global scale. I think these are the important issues which I think you can maybe take as a matrix when you look at the different topics to which you devote your attention in the various sessions of this conference. So maybe that for an introductory comment from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I just wish you a very fruitful conference. And many thanks again to the organizers for having put all this together. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much, dear colleague and dear Stefan Stetter. Let me first of all thank the organizers too, and for their kind invitation, and of course and Amélie, and also our French ambassador who just opened the session. I'm very happy to participate to that. Thanks for that. Amélie and her colleague asked us to be reminded us that it was necessary to be young and innovative. So I'll try to be innovative because it's pretty late for me to be young now. But let's try this together after the very challenging insights and ideas and hypotheses of my colleague Stefan Stetter. I would like to insist on the limits on the EU autonomy, on Europe as an autonomous actor, especially in its external action. Of course. What can we do to change things? If I ask this question, it's because it's been maybe 3 decades that my generation has been hearing about Europe, European power, Europe as an international actor, and heard about Europe's strategic documents, not so many though, Solana and a more recent one in 2016 that Stefan already mentioned. We have seen Maastricht, the Title V of Maastricht, and different acronyms, CSDP, ESDP, EEAS. Now, new concept again, strategic compass, and so on. For what result? Let's try to be in the mind of public opinions or students. Is Europe a game changer? No. After all those acronyms, after all those documents, concepts, and debates about the machinery of the EU, which doesn't mean, we will come back to that there is no progress. But after all such debates, Europe is not a game changer in international relations. It is maybe even more in certain fields a theater than an actor, a theater for external influences. You read a lot about Chinese influence in Europe, Russian influence in Europe, American influence in Europe, of course, sometimes from the Gulf states, from wherever you want. Do we read a lot about the EU's strategies of influence that could be wielded in different regions? Not that much. So to raise the question brutally, do we have to forget about any hope of staying in history between the US, China, and probably some other soon? Do we have just to give up the idea of Europe as an international power and just hope that we can go on talking about the machinery and the concepts and the acronyms, and that nothing dramatic will happen? I think that this kind of brutal question is now present in the minds of many students that I could talk with. So let's try to, I would like to propose some hints about the reasons for disappointment and maybe some tracks for hope. First point, it all started with what Christopher Hill, a British politist, a British academic, called, very rightly, he said it all in 1993, the expectation capability gap. When Europe announced at the turn of the 90s that it would have a common foreign policy, it would have the will to be a strategic actor, these created expectations in the world. Some fears, maybe, but expectations that Europe would be a major actor. The capabilities of Europe to meet these expectations were much narrower. It started with false hopes, lack of influence, and missed opportunity. If I'm saying that, it's not because I'm a Eurosceptical or anti-European. Otherwise, I would not probably be here with you today. On the contrary, of course, I really support the idea of Europe. I really think it's the only option, but we have to do something. Remember the 90s, not you students, because you were not born, but you heard about it. The war in Yugoslavia in the early 90s, when then Luxembourg's Minister Jack Post said the time of Europe has come. We will deal with what's happening in Yugoslavia, with a terrible civil war in former Yugoslavia. Everybody remembers that finally the first agreements in 1995 were signed in the US, in Dayton, and finally NATO intervened in 1999, and the US did most of the job. 1991 was also the Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait in August 1990, and the United States intervened with a broad coalition. Europe as such, the EU, it was not the EU yet, but I mean, Europe as a common market of the European community was not present as such. Then the Middle East peace process. Europe was not absent, but Europe made its best to accompany the process too late. The process started in 1993. By the time when Europe woke up and made some proposal to support the process, mostly with projects like the MEDA agreements or different schemes for the Mediterranean region, it was too late. The peace process had come to an end after the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. And when Europe tried to support a process that was no more, it was pretty clear we had a better idea of what were the limits of the EU as an autonomous actor. The EU was able to support something that already existed, with lip service and money and infrastructures and many things, but was not really able to stop a process from drifting away, was not really able to say who's responsible for that, to sanction anyone, or to be more political. Europe was good at accompanying already politically correct and fair weather processes. Europe was not that good to challenge a more difficult situation. Same thing for the Great Lakes region. You probably, the less young among you, would remember that two very old jokes, American jokes about Europe. The very old one was from Henry Kissinger. You know, when he said, "I would like to call Europe, but don't have any phone number." And another joke was when in the 90s and 2000s, the Americans said that the Americans do the cooking and Europe does the washing up. So it's a problem. It's a problem because after that, we were at the time living in a moment when we were hoping that everything would go well, that everything would be okay, that we could go on like that, accompanying virtuous processes, and everything would be perfect. And then things began to be a little bit less optimistic. The return of the giants happened. Russia intervened in Georgia in 2008, then destabilized East Ukraine, and with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, then intervened in Syria after many Western hesitations. China, of course, did more than wake up. China started to be much more assertive after 2009, and yet again after Xi Jinping's appointment after 2013. At the same time, Europe had geopolitical setbacks. The election of Donald Trump was a difficult moment. The Brexit was a difficult moment. The rise of so-called illiberalism in some parts of Central and Eastern Europe, not only, is still a difficult moment. So where are we now? Where are we now? My second point would be that the hypothesis is that Europe has a problem with power, with the concept of power, for very understandable reasons, by the way. Europe is dependent on other powers, or sometimes some of its member states, for hard power. I remember two sentences. It was off, but I can make them public. It was in the course or in the conference. I remember Professor Ghassan Salameh, whom you probably remember for having been the UN envoy for Libya and many other UN missions, but it was also an academic at Sciences Po, and I was one of his students some years ago. When he told us very cynically, Europe has a common policy. Its name is NATO. And more recently, my dear colleague Sven Biscop in Brussels in a conference said Europe has a rapid reaction force. It's called France. Because it's the only country we always want to intervene everywhere, but the other ones don't, which is maybe sometimes more reasonable, but that's the situation. So the problem is that more deeply, Europe was traumatized by power and doesn't want to wield geopolitical power anymore. Europe was traumatized by power because Europe was, of course, the cradle of two world wars. Europe committed suicide in history during two world wars. So the concept of power is frightening to the Europeans right now. Europe has constructed intellectually a post-tragic world and wanted to stick to it. Europe wanted to be convinced that everything would be okay forever. You know, the Soviet Union had vanished. So no more Cold War, no more threat on the east side of Europe. I remember some French former defense ministers saying that they didn't really understand why we should still have a big budget for defense since there was no threat anymore. I remember that, even in France. The Mediterranean seemed to be there and remain the same forever, with regimes that were in charge for decades. Gaddafi since 1969, Ben Ali in Tunisia since 87, the Syrian regime with the Al-Assad family since 1969 with the father, Mubarak since 81, and so nothing would be moving. So it was a post-tragic world. Europe was considering war and war-torn countries as the problem of other regions that where Europe could help, but certainly not as a problem, war, crises, tragedies, certainly not as problems that could happen in the neighborhood. And then came the collapse of the two geopolitical environments. Russia started to be assertive again, Georgia, Ukraine, etc. And of course, the Mediterranean region exploded after the so-called Arab Springs of the Arab upheavals, which destabilized the region. Only Tunisia came out of that with more democracy, although fragile. The rest of the Mediterranean fell into civil wars or the return of autocracy and so on. So it was a very painful wake-up call for Europe. Still, we had the impression that beyond the discourse, nothing changed. Only the Russian threat strikes some chords in some Central European states and in the Baltic states. Of course, there is a concrete physical threat which is felt deeply by some of our partners in Eastern and Central Europe. But for the rest, China seems always so far away, and so on. Europe was also traumatized by the colonial era and the trial of the colonial era, and thus doesn't want to talk about domination anymore. Europe was traumatized by propaganda during the Second War, during the Cold War, and thus doesn't want to handle the concept of influence or influence strategy too much. Influence is perceived as something maybe illegitimate, something bad in Europe, probably because of this past where influence equals propaganda. The problem is that we are now in a world of influence, in a struggle of influence, fake news, you know all that, trolls, different strategies of influence. The US has been very good at influencing the world too, and so on. So is there an EU, is there an influence strategy of the EU? Not that much, not that much. Beyond discourses, not that much. I'm not calling for sharp power. I'm not calling for doing the same, destabilizing other countries or playing havoc in other countries, not at all. But do we have a narrative? Do we have a strategy? Not really. I can tell you a story that was reminded to me by a former student. He was in the country, I think it was in the Balkans, where the brand new highway had been paid by the EU, and the shelter for the bus station, the bus stop, had been paid by the United States. And you could find billboards everywhere indicating that the shelter had been paid by the US, but nowhere it could be seen or read that the highway had been paid by the EU. So there is not really visibility or strategy of influence. Maybe because Europe thinks it's wrong to do that. Maybe it's not clean to do that, which can be understood. It's absolutely acceptable to reject any kind of propaganda, but we are in times of influence and we have to defend ourselves. Let's not be vegetarians in a world where everybody wants to eat meat, as a former German foreign minister once said. I'm not saying that Europe is not existing. There are great successes, no conflicts among the member states, which is a huge thing. I remember in the 90s when everybody was afraid or criticizing the fact that France and Germany did not agree on the independence of Slovenia or Croatia. Okay, but remember that 1 century before, when France and Germany disagreed about the Balkans, it was quite another story. So, okay, we don't agree all the time, but there is no conflict among us anymore, which is a great achievement. Europe is a real lobby in the international trade. Europe is a real actor as far as human security is concerned, including climate change and so on. Europe pays a lot of infrastructures. Europe does a lot to support some populations. So Europe is an actor in human security. The problem lies with hard power. And our problem is that soft power isn't replace hard power. It's just a prolongation. You are credible, you are attractive when people know you have some power behind, when people know that you are able to show some power if necessary. And Europe does not. Everybody knows that Europe will not send troops, boats, or whatever. And this is a limit. So to reach a conclusion, what next? What can we do from that? Maybe 5 hints that I leave to your comments or hypotheses. First of all, I think we should stop talking about the machinery, because acronyms, new text, we congratulate that we could find a new concept or a new acronym. I give you a few acronyms earlier, like EEAS or ESDP or CSDP or whatever. This contributes to the public skepticism. There are too many acronyms for too little results. So maybe let's talk about what we can do concretely, and let's stop talking about the machinery. Second, maybe we have to, unfortunately, to stop sticking to the strategy of the founder fathers. What was the strategy? The strategy of the founder fathers was to avoid talking about hot issues and make countries work together, cooperate together on consensual issues. That was the method used to reconcile France and Germany, for instance, after the Second War, with the European Community of Coal and Steel. Let's work together on technical issues, and then by getting used to work together, we will address the other issue. Let's be progressive. Unfortunately, this strategy doesn't work in a tragic world today. It worked at a time when the world needed to be appeased, needed more cooperation after terrible times, when neighbors needed to talk again. But now the problem is that Europe's strategy to address more technical issues, to create a habit to work together, is more difficult, because we all have in mind the more dramatic events that take place in the world. I just give you the example of the Euro-made strategy. Since the 90s, and especially since the Oslo Agreement and the attempts to build peace in the Middle East, Europe, the EU, has been trying to build a kind of Euro-Mediterranean dialogue or partnership. What was the method? The method was to gather everyone around the table to talk about soft issues like depolluting the Mediterranean, students exchange, kind of Erasmus program for the Mediterranean, think tanks, environment, and so on. Great, real topics. But the problem is we are talking about a region where dramatic things happen. Libya, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, many wars since the 90s. It's very difficult to resume talks and to gather people to talk about this kind of topic when everybody knows that something dramatic is happening at the same time. It's difficult to make Israelis and Palestinians, or Turks and Greeks, or whatever you want, come together to talk about depolluting the Mediterranean when the things you know are just happening next door. And so Europe has to tackle now to tackle the real hot topics and have some political positions about the most important and the most dramatic events that are unfolding before our eyes. Third point, we really have to think about the strategy of influence and counter-influence. Europe cannot be the theater of external influence without having the right tools to defend itself. You all read about Italy participating to the Belt and the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. You all heard about some countries very sensitive to the Russian influence. You all heard about some countries stopping to discuss certain topics within the EU because of American pressures. We all heard about that. It's probably time now, of course, in Turkey's pressures on the migrants and so on. We have to find the right tools, which are probably to sensibilize the populations, the European populations, much more to the struggle of influence that takes place in the world and in Europe right now, and maybe have the tools for counter influence, maybe some offensive tools sometimes if needed. A fourth point is that we have to formulate some determined and visible actions with a vanguard, which should probably include the non-EU members, Britain and Norway, for instance. Where and when, this is precisely something to find. Where can Europe make the difference today in the world? I don't know. We could ask the students, where do you think that Europe as EU, or maybe with just a core Europe and some kind of spearhead, the vanguard with some countries, could make the difference? Where? Myanmar? I have no idea. South China Sea, where do you think we could make a difference and play a positive role, even at the price of sending ships or troops to guarantee peace or ceasefire or whatever, which would not be too big for us to handle at the beginning, and where people in Europe and in the world could see and say very clearly, yes, Europe made the difference. Fortunately, Europe was there. We need some actions and some examples like that. We need that people in the world, the European citizens and the rest of the world, can say, we are very grateful and fortunate that Europe was there. We need some examples, concrete examples like that, much more than talking about acronyms. And finally, last point, we have to work and capitalize on something that so far has been an obstacle, but that could be a wonderful opportunity, which is the complementarity and the difference between France and Germany on the concept of responsibility. I will just take 1 second to explain. I've heard in many discussions with my German friends, and I could identify a problem. France considers that a military intervention abroad means we take our responsibilities. We are, permanent member of the UN Security Council and so on. So there is a situation, an urgent situation somewhere in the world. For France, it's mostly in Africa. We will intervene. This is our sense of responsibility. I could feel in many discussions that from my German friends that in Germany, this was this kind of, all direction intervention is maybe sometimes the synonym of irresponsibility. France has a very quick decision process. When France intervened in Mali, there were 6 or 7 hours between the moment when the president summoned the Defense Council and the first airstrikes in Mali. Germany, on the contrary, is a slow but very consensual decision process, including the parliament, including different actors. Reconciliating those two, working on the complementarity between those two approaches would be a wonderful asset for Europe. Because if you take the French rapid decision-making process, plus Germany's ability to build a consensus, a political consensus before intervening or before choosing an orientation in foreign policy, if you can make the two work together, if the French decision process way, and the German ability to build a political consensus on this kind of action, that would be a real complementarity for Europe, and that's probably some of the tracks we can work on together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Charillon, Clermont-Ferrand, and Professor Stetter here in Munich to raise many of those issues that we have to talk about and that we want to talk about during the fellowship program that will be organized after the conference. We received one question and we have a little moment to maybe ask some others. Let's see. The first question that I would ask you is, especially regarding soft and hard power that you just mentioned, Professor Charillon, and the huge struggle for Europe to find its geopolitical place of influence in the world, is if Europe has any kind of leverage in the geopolitical architecture, it could be in trade. Can this be used to promote a stronger European impact in security issues?
I can answer, but maybe my colleague wants to answer too.
Yeah, feel free.
Okay, I start.
You go first, and I'll follow.
Okay. It's an excellent question because it raises the question of translation of some kind of power into another kind of power, and that's probably where the United States is very good. This kind of transitivity of power, if I may say, turning commercial power into political power, turning cultural presence into commercial presence, turning military strength into economic opportunities, and so on. The US is very good at that. Europe, much less. Can we work on that? Can we do something better about that? Probably yes, but how? How to do it without losing our soul or European spirit? Doing just like the US, a brutal way, for instance, extra international sanctions, extraterritorial sanctions is not and should not be in Europe's DNA. I don't think that's a good model. But trying to play more on our commercial presence, to sensibilize the public opinions to what is at stake politically, and explain that they cannot at the same time take advantage of European products, European prices, and so on, without any political support given to Europe, would be probably a good thing to do. We have to try to, some countries with, I think, some countries in the EU are able to do that. I think it's Europe as such has difficulties to turn its commercial influence into political influence, but some countries, I'm thinking about Germany or the UK, are pretty good at that. The UK is not in the EU anymore, of course, but there are good practices, they have good governance, or good examples, probably. And I think that your question should be indeed on the agenda, on the progresses to be made for the EU. How can we turn? It's a reality. You're right. Europe is pretty good as an international actor, not as a political actor. How to turn the first one into the second one? That could be on the agenda to find measures to improve this transitivity.
Yes, I completely agree, and maybe I can add a few perspectives on that, which I also think is a very important question, because trade relates to economy, and economy is really the fundament of European power. That is the one sphere where Europe really wields international power and influence. But you don't translate economic power into political power so easily. I think that is something that has to be clearly understood. I think it's a very interesting debate, and it reminds me of this country called West Germany, where after the Second World War, Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who was very interested in foreign politics, framed or had this phrase, which was when he was asked, should West Germany be an international power? He said, no, 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 no. Germany, and he meant West Germany, is an economic giant, but a political dwarf. And that was understatement. Helmut Schmidt came from Hamburg, and also I think if you look at the Adenauer, Brandt, or Schmidt or Kohl governments, they were very important political players, but they understood that after 2 world wars lost by Germany and started by Germany, you don't get on the international stage and you say that you want to have power. You have to do that in concert. You have to rearrange what Germans understand power to be. I think this very much relates to what Friedrich, you have said about the uneasiness, which I think not only Germans, but many Europeans have with the concept of power. But of course, Helmut Schmidt also always meant that he wants to have some kind of international power. So playing with this economic power of West Germany in the 1970s was a way of not talking too much of political power. But of course, Schmidt, like other West German chancellors, and I think like European leaders today, they want to have some political power. It's very difficult to translate trade-related power, and Europe has this trade-related power, because if you ask outside of the European Union, why do you want to have a strong, good relationship with the European Union? Most countries from the Western Balkans who have an accession perspective to the European membership perspective, to countries in the European neighborhood, to countries like Australia or India or Indonesia, that they want to have a strong and good relationship with Europe because of trade relations, because of economic perspectives. But it's very difficult to translate this into political influence. I think the 1990s were an attempt in that. The Euro-Mediterranean partnership was exactly built on this understanding, or the European neighborhood policy in the 2000s. You have a ring of friends, as Romano Prodi, the Commission president, once said. You have very strong trade relations, association agreements, because countries in the neighborhood simply are interested in that and also dependent on the European Union. They have to have trade agreements with the European Union. And then the hope of the 1990s was, okay, this will then translate into the political sphere. These countries will over time have stronger interrelations with the European Union. They will transform domestically. They will become more open. There will be a process of transformation and of democratic reform. And I think we have seen that this failed. This does not happen automatically. And for that, and I don't want to give a conclusive answer, I think it's very important what Friedrich has said in his presentation before, that Europe has to have a stronger debate on what kind of interests does Europe has? What kind of influence do we want to have in the world? I think this is a very important debate, because otherwise you have this, you mentioned the capability expectation gap, and I think there's another gap, and this is the gap between the lofty rhetorics of human rights, of peace, love, and happiness, and on the other hand, the reality of pragmatic policymaking. And there's also a gap between the two, because Europe speaks this language of human rights, etc., which I think is essential and important. But it sometimes clashes with the reality when Europe engages with the Egyptian government and other governments which don't care about these values at all. And I think it's better to put this on the table and be frank about this. And this requires not to give up and abandon the discourse of human rights, but also to much more strongly engage in a discourse of interests Europe has and how it wants to achieve these interests. But I think it is important, but it's not a shortcut. You cannot say, well, we just focus on trade and this will automatically lead to political influence. It will not work like this. But definitely trade is important. And as I said before, it's also, I think, the fundament of Europe's place in the world. Europe has prosperity. It has to develop and protect this prosperity, but certainly this is a fundament from which to start in order to have international influence, but it will not happen automatically.
Yeah, of course. And regarding when you speak about peace and peacekeeping precisely, raises a little bit the question what happens right now in the Southern Caucasus, for example, when the people request that the EU should help actually managing and supporting to solve the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. How could the EU, for instance, provide peace there in the region? What do you think? What kind of solutions do we have there?
Well, I'm personally, I wouldn't put too much burden on Europe. I think the example from the 1990s is very important, that Europe was completely unable to react on what happened in the Balkans back then. That was a very devastating experience, and this has been analyzed here on this floor before. But also the expectation should not be that Europe alone can solve international conflicts. It's simply not working. Even the Americans have great problems in order to solve conflicts, from Haiti to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to Syria and others. I think this is what we see in international politics. I think it is important, though, that Europe has an active role in conflicts. We have to go back, and I think that is the work that has to be done. And I'm a little bit more optimistic with the change to the Biden administration, that effective multilateralism, which is a kind of, the headline which Europe always makes in relation to global governance. Effective multilateralism is not just there for health politics or for trade relations. We also need effective multilateralism in order to solve or at least stabilize conflict regions. We have to have effective multilateralism. The European Union should be part of international contact groups, and that is the work of diplomacy. It's a very daunting and complex task. But my answer would be: don't expect the European Union to automatically solve all possible conflicts. Also, because sometimes the European Union is seen by others as a conflict party, not as a mediator. So this requires the EU to also change its self-image, I think, not just see itself as this policy model for the 22nd century, which just has good intentions. No, Europe has interests and others, and it might clash with the interest of others, but also to make very strong efforts with the Americans, with others, to bring the notion of effective multilateralism back from the global governance areas to conflict governance. I think that would be very essential.
Yeah, just one word to complete. I totally agree with what Stefan said. The problem we know is, before being an actor, we have to agree on what we want to do and what we want to defend as an actor. I totally agree with this very important idea that Europe should not be only an external mediator, but should be maybe not an actor in conflict, but at least a power that defends a vision or some interest, not only a mediator. But for that, we need to have a vision of what we want for ourselves. So we have to get rid of the old problem of unanimity, or we will never agree to all of us, the 27 members. We will never agree on everything. That will not happen. So we have to find a solution to allow some actions. There were some reflections: Vanguard Europe, Core Europe, Flexible Europe, and so on and so on. This is probably the condition for Europe to be more an actor in international relations. We have to let the countries who want to do something do it in the name of some very clearly expressed interests.
And Professor Charion, precisely regarding power of the European Union and the United Nations, for instance, of course, it is a question that is in the air since a very long time. could the EU have its veto in the United Nations, and would France eventually agree this transfer of power? What do you think?
I think this will not happen because it's about countries at the UN, only countries. So far, that's the only possibility. So it would need to reform the UN system, and if you do it for the EU, probably other international or regional groups will want to do this. It would be too many problems. And suppose that we have just one seat for Europe, for the EU at the UN, what would we make of it? We have to, if we don't agree ourselves, if we want about the use we want for our veto, right? That will be even worse, I was myself in favor a long time ago. It was during the war in Iraq, 2003. There was a reflection in France about should France put its veto against the American war in Iraq. And I was very much in favor at the time of a European consultation. My opinion at the time was that France should have consulted its European partners to ask them if they would agree, if a majority of them would agree to oppose the war, which was the French intention. And if there was a majority to oppose the war, France would have put its veto in the name of Europe. Otherwise, if a majority of our partners in Europe disagreed with our approach, then we could have chosen abstention to respect the fact that, okay, we were against the war, but maybe some other European states disagreed with us, so we would respect that and find a compromise. I think this kind of thing should be, we should work on that, and we should also work on the fact that the UN Security Council and the right of veto should be extended to other countries. And we all know that it's the mechanism of the UN which is a problem today, because it has been, it has been built and invented in 1945 at a time when the Soviet Union existed, or in times when the Taiwanese economy was superior to the mainland China's economy, when Yugoslavia existed, and so on and so on. So maybe it's time to reform the UN system and find between us, Europeans, a way to have a common vision. If we just transfer the problem to the UN, if we still disagree on almost everything, having a common seat at the UN will not be a solution. It will just transfer the solution to the higher level.
Yeah, totally. And this lets me to talk about the question of respect and the power of the European Union to bring this kind of respect for its own foreign policy into the regions that especially surround us. Professor Stetter, what do you think of this point regarding especially the EU's capacity of responding to diplomatic insults, especially by countries, for instance, that are in very difficult situations regarding the EU's diplomatic capabilities, Russia and Turkey?
Well, obviously, Europe is in a geopolitical competition with Russia and with Turkey, which for those of you and us who are historians has much probably longer and older historical roots. I think important is that we in Europe have an internal debate on foreign policy. I think it was a very important point which was just made, which I really would like to underline, that simply transferring the issue to should Europe have a seat in the United Nations Security Council is not the debate which we need at this moment. You can be in favor of this or opposed. It sounds nice, of course, and if you consider, well, from a European perspective, as a European citizen, it sounds like a good idea, but it's not what it is about. It's really this debate about a reform of the United Nations. And I have used the concept of resilience before in my talk. It's about changing the international system. So, and for this change of the international system, I think the European Union has to do much more homework first in order to become fully a foreign policy actor that can act responsibly in international relations and effectively and positively. And there are elements of European foreign policy which work in that direction, but this has to be strengthened. And I think the one element here, and that is pragmatic, we also have to talk not just about the lofty ideas, but also about pragmatic steps and getting rid of unanimity in some parts of foreign policy certainly is one important element here. And the second one is to transform Europe domestically. The European project, and I would like to say again what I said before, European integration is not an elite project. It's in the vested interest of many people. And if we look at the issue of European identity, we can see that in many different social milieus in member states, there's a strong European identity out there. But foreign policy will only work if it has the citizen support, if the European Union has a strong support, not just from governments, member states, but also from citizens across the European Union. I think this is very important. This is a very big resource for foreign policy. Why? Because if you look at the Barometer, which is the the opinion polling done by the European Union biannually, and you can check this online. If you look at what Europeans say, in which area they would like to see more European integration, it is in particular foreign and defense policy. It's an expectation. It's not just an elite project of diplomats, of academics like us, of military people, of whomever who want to have more political integration in foreign and defense policy. It's an issue on which Europeans say this is one of the top priorities for us, where we would like to see Europe act more united and more effectively. And I think, and this kind of hopefully answers your question, in order to positively engage with Russia and China and Turkey, and there are many conflicts with these countries, and I also see them in the next decades. There are incompatible interests, but of course, they shouldn't be solved in wars or military confrontation. There will be tensions with Russia and Turkey and China for sure. But in order to address these diverging interests, I think it's important to build on this shared interest of Europeans in foreign policy. And I think more work has to be done on precisely at that level. It's an expectation by European unions, by European citizens, that Europe acts more resourcefully in foreign relations. And I think that is the building block. And if this is used as a resource, I think it can be very constructively used in relation to these other powers you just mentioned.
I think I will ask one last question, because it is very important to underline what you just said, Professor Stetter, that the European Union is not a lead project. And regarding this point of institutional leverage and the institutional project now, which is the Conference on the Future of Europe, do you think that this can actually be a project to ensure that the European Union is not communicated anymore as an elite project?
Yes, indirectly, yes. I think one of the big issues of the Conference for the Future of Europe is maybe paving the way for a treaty revision at some point ahead, maybe. The important issue, though, I think, is to really have a debate, and this only indirect relates to foreign policy, but as I've said before, I think there is this indirect relationship. But to transform the European Union domestically, to democratize, further democratize the European Union. I think this is the key issue of this conference for the future of Europe. Citizens' participation, or I think this neoliberal term now is ownership. This ownership, strengthening the sense of European citizenship. We are EU citizens, all of us, most of us who sit here. We have a shared political culture and identity. And to strengthen this, maybe in our party systems, in relation to issues of elections, you know, this direct election of Commission President always comes up, transnational lists for European Parliament elections. And I think this is a very important issue, and it's I think it's related to foreign policy, but indirectly. But it's a prerequisite, I think, for successful foreign policy. And maybe my last comment is because the United States has been mentioned before. One of the strengths of the United States as an international actor are, of course, the capacities of the United States from a military and economic perspective. But it's also the status of its society, like Tocqueville wrote when he visited the United States 2 centuries ago, and he was writing about this democratic culture in the United States. And this, I think, is a big resource for the United States. And the United States is in crisis when this doesn't function properly, as during the last 1 or 2 decades, arguably. But it shows us the direction, I think, which the European Union also should go. And I hope that the Conference for the Future of Europe will particularly work on this aspect of citizen participation, sense of political identity, and further democratizing EU politics.
Professor Charian, do you want to add something?
No, I won't be long because I know it's the end of your session, but I I totally agree with has just been said, just that Europe has indeed to communicate its project and propose a vision. I think it's not quite difficult because we are in a world which is very divided. Today we can see tensions rising everywhere. We can see that multilateralism has met some difficulties recently. We could see that tensions are very high in certain regions, and the democracy is maybe under attack. So I think it's the right moment for Europe. It's not only an opportunity; it is a necessity, and it might be a moral obligation for Europe, given the project of its fathers, to have a clear message for the world today. We know more or less the US message. We know now the Chinese message, which is a criticism of democracy, with connectivity replacing democracy. What is the European project? We have to indeed to agree, to discuss, to all together about that and communicate better on that, and then implement. It's not an easy task. It's easy said, but not done.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was an incredible first conversation, and we are very happy to work with you together on those issues in the future. I am sad that I'm forced now to close this first conversation and the first session of the YSC, and I invite everybody to join us at 1:30 precisely for the session on European sovereignty. We'll have then a second session on health security, and the third for today on the European Union and the neighborhood. Thank you very much again. Merci beaucoup à Munich and Clermont-Ferrand. See you soon, talk to you later, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. See you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.